That's what I said. I got ripped to shreds by Don Cheadle, an Avenger. I got ripped to shreds by Axl Rose. He called me a piece of shit. Are we allowed to say that on your podcast? I'm quoting here. He called me Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses, called me a piece of shit. Many people in the medical community attacked me for not condemning Donald Trump's rally. But here's the thing. At the same time, Donald Trump was holding his rally. There were Black Lives Matter protests going on all across the country. And if I went on CNN or MSNBC and condemned Donald Trump's rally in Mount Rushmore, I was going to have to go on Fox News and tell Sean Hannity why I wasn't also condemning the Black Lives Matter rallies. Watch out.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership today. As promised, this month's shows are all about emergency readiness and response, and we have another exclusive guest who knows way too much about that, former United States Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams. Dr. Adams grew up on the family farm in Mechanicsville, Maryland, and earned a dual degree in biochemistry and biopsychology at the University of Maryland. Next, Dr. Adams earned his medical degree at Indiana University before later earning a Master of Public Health at UC Berkeley. Dr. Adams undertook his internship at St. Vincent's in Indianapolis and finished his training in anesthesiology back at his alma mater, Indiana University. In October 2014, Adams was appointed Indiana State Health Commissioner by Governor Mike Pence and reappointed by Governor Eric Holcomb in 2017. Midway through 2017, President Donald Trump nominated Dr. Adams as Surgeon General of the United States. Upon his confirmation and swearing in as the 20th U.S. Surgeon General and only the second Black man to hold that honor, Dr. Adams set his immediate focus on the opioid epidemic, and the following year launched a campaign to promote seasonal flu vaccinations following one of the worst flu seasons on record. In February 2020, Dr. Adams was appointed by the White House to the task force dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, he is the Distinguished Professor and Director of Health Equity at Purdue University, while also teaching anesthesiology at Indiana University School of Medicine. And finally, Dr. Adams is also the author of my new favorite book, Crisis and Chaos: Lessons from the Front Lines of the War Against COVID-19. Dr. Adams, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me with you today. Wow, that was quite the introduction. I'm always blown away with all the places life has taken me. And I appreciate you mentioning my book, which I wrote because I felt we continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And I know we're going to get into that during some of the conversation today. So thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to just hit you with the first question that's on my mind. Was it a hard book to write?
You know, I've written journal articles. I've written opinion editorials. I've done a lot of traditional writing from the standpoint of a physician. But this was my first book for the broader public. And it was a very, very different experience. That was a big learning experience for me, going back and forth with editors and with publishers about everything from the title to the book cover. A little bit of humble pie there. You know, in my first book that I wrote, there's not a picture of me on the front of it. Why? Because my publishers thought it would be better to have this shocking image of, someone in a hazmat suit on the front of the book. And so that was different. It was a little bit of PTSD writing the book. So much of what we went through during COVID, we pushed out of the back of our minds. You know, I often say to folks, remember when we didn't know if it was safe to bring groceries in the front door, when we didn't know if we had to sanitize our mail before we brought it in, or if an Amazon package was safe. And those are things that we've completely forgotten about. So a little bit of PTSD and a little bit of therapy. Again, sometimes talking through issues helps you deal with them in the current state. So a lot of emotions in the process. I'm very glad I went through it. It was also a lot longer process even than writing a journal article. But I hope that people get to read it. What's interesting is, and this is feedback I've gotten on it, I wrote the book in the same style that I tend to speak, and that's in stories and in narratives. And a lot of people say it reads more like a story than like a medical textbook or a scientific textbook. And to me, that was a great compliment.
I think you wrote it in a way that anybody will be able to read it and understand it. When we met for the first time in Boston at the AAPL, the Chief Medical Officer Academy, you gave books to our class. And on the way home on the plane, I opened the book you gave me. And I think I read it in 2 days. I simply could not put it down. And it brought back so many memories, many of which you just alluded to. And that could fill this podcast for like 5 hours, but we're not going to do that. And I loved it. And one piece in particular, I really have to read it out loud for all of my buddies. Like me, I was a chief medical officer while you were in DC. I was in my incident command center. You were in charge of so many things and being on the task force. And I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna read the dedication, and it starts with, to my wife Lacey and my kids, Caden, Eli, and Millie. Thank you for your love and support. To all who lost their lives or health to COVID-19, and to all who did their best to protect others during this once in a century pandemic, this book was written in the hopes that your suffering can help prevent the future suffering of others. You are true to your word and you're a true man. You said you wrote this for others. You said we have to stop making some of the same mistakes. That dedication hit me right in right in the chest, and I know that it will hit my buddies that all went through this with me. So, damn it, man, this is good stuff, and I thank you for that.
Thank you for acknowledging that because there were a ton of mistakes. It was a once in a century pandemic. We didn't have great information. One of the lessons from the book that any chief medical officer will appreciate, and that I shared with you and the other CMOs in Boston, was that you can't make good decisions if you have bad data or no data. But all that said, as we're talking about the mistakes that are made, uh, I feel that we so often lose sight of the humanity, the fact that there were a bunch of people who were just trying their damnedest to do the best that they could under the circumstances. And now we want to demonize them for the decisions that they made. We want to question their motives. You even hear, lock them up when they're talking about people like Dr. Fauci. And so it was important to me not just to write that book, but even that description that you read. That was another debate with the publishers. They said, "What do you want to say on your jacket?" And I said, if no one else reads anything in this book, I want them to know that the reason this book was written was not to dish dirt on Donald Trump or to try to defend myself. It was really to help people understand what all of us were going through, and how we can do a better job of preventing it in the future.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, let's go back to some of the beginnings, and I think this will make a lot of sense to our listeners as we walk through this. But you shared something with us I want you to share with the listeners, your lifelong illness with asthma, and how that began to shape your approach, not just to life, but to your leadership. So would you expand on that?
Absolutely. We opened the book talking about one of the most impactful experiences I had in my life. When I was 8 years old, I had a severe asthma attack, status asthmaticus. And it was so severe that I had to be medevaced from the small rural hospital where I presented to Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And so I share that story for a number of reasons. But one of the most important things about that story is that different people have different opportunities and different challenges in terms of their ability to be healthy. For me, I grew up in a farming community. And anyone who's grown up in a farming community knows when the combines come through, dust goes up in the air, and anyone who's got any sort of respiratory issues is more likely to end up in the doctor's office or the hospital. And that happened to me over and over and over again. That wasn't my fault. I didn't choose where I was born, but I was facing a different burden of disease because of it. Beyond that, we know that people who are Black, particularly Black boys, are far more likely to be diagnosed with asthma, to be hospitalized with asthma. I didn't choose to be born Black. But that said, it's important to understand that I faced a higher burden of disease, a higher chance of dying simply because of the color of my skin. Now, that said, that is a proxy for so many other risk factors. But we do need to recognize that certain groups and certain people need certain things, and that speaks to the role that I'm in right now. as director of health equity. Health equity is simply recognizing that not everyone has the same opportunities to make healthy choices and to be healthy, and giving people what they need to be healthy. So even before I had an interest in going into medicine, even before I really knew what that meant, I inherently, because of my life experiences, understood that different people, in this case myself, didn't have fair opportunities to make healthy choices and to be healthy. And it shaped a lot of the way I've looked at policy throughout my career. One of the things that I always try to do, and I encourage others to do, is to tell your authentic story. And my authentic story is that I almost died when I was 8 years old, and that has really instilled in me the importance of speaking up for people who come from marginalized communities, people who have different risk factors. And it's why I'm so disturbed right now at a lot of the attacks on our ability to look at people's different risk factors. And let's be more concrete here. DEI, and I have a op-ed out there that came out in February of this year, where I called upon us to have a better, a more nuanced conversation around DEI. We've taken these three letters and turned them into a bad word, into a curse word, and in the process, we've in many cases abandoned or walked away from efforts to understand the unique burdens that different communities face. But it's something that I understand deeply in a way that a lot of people don't.
Very well stated, eloquent and elegant. And we're going to double down because you also told us in Boston about your family life and about your brother. And your brother has struggled with addiction issues in his life. And that framed how you attacked the opioid epidemic while in office. So maybe you could elaborate and share a little bit. And you don't have to give away the book story. We do want people to
No,
get your
no, no.
book.
I love it. I love having these conversations, and I'll even go back a little bit before my time as Surgeon General. I was Indiana State Health Commissioner, as you mentioned, and during my time as Indiana State Health Commissioner, we had the largest HIV outbreak related to injection drug use in the history of the United States. In rural Scott County, Indiana, a community that was 95% plus white, rural, had never had more than two HIV cases recorded in a year in its entire history, had over 100 cases of HIV in a year related to injection drug use. It was really the canary in the coal mine, if you will, in many ways, for the opioid epidemic as it traveled across Appalachia, through Kentucky and Ohio and southern Indiana and West Virginia. And my challenge was, as a Black man from the East Coast, I had to go to this rural white community and try to implement a syringe service program. And so one of the things I did was move to this community and really get to know the people, go to church with them, go to school with them, spend time with them. And one of the lessons from the book that this story leads to is that people need to know that you care before they care what you know. No one was going to listen to this Black guy from the East Coast coming into their rural white Christian conservative community telling them, I'm the doctor and I know best. You need to start a syringe service program. But one of the things that I was able to do to create a connection with them, and this goes back to the comment I just made to you about telling your own story and being your authentic self, was about my own brother. My brother Philip has suffered and struggled with substance use disorder for most of his adult life. In fact, when I was Surgeon General of the United States, he was in a jail cell about 20 miles away in Jessup, Maryland. So I'm standing next to, speaking with the President of the United States in the Oval Office, and my brother was in a jail cell. But talking about those struggles openly and honestly with the people of Scott County made them understand that I was truly speaking from a place of compassion and of knowledge about what they were going through. And that opened the door to have conversations about the science and about the things that we needed to do to move forward. But when I became Surgeon General, because of what happened in Scott County and because of what I'd gone through with my brother, one of the things I decided to prioritize was the opioid epidemic. So what's interesting about being Surgeon General is everybody wants you to make their priority your priority. And there's only one of you. And there's countless issues that you could take on. So when you become a Surgeon General, you try to figure out, okay, what is an issue that is incredibly important at this time. And then you want to find out where that overlaps in the Venn diagram with, is there an intervention or a message that I can put out there that will help us make progress in this space? And then you want to also figure out, ideally, is there a place where I have unique credibility to speak on this issue? And for me, it was the opioid epidemic killing a person every 10 to 11 minutes. It was naloxone as a potential remedy. And it was the story of my brother and my family and the very real day to day fear that I experienced in terms of my brother being the next victim potentially of an opioid overdose. And so those three things came together and allowed me to put out the first Surgeon General's advisory in over a decade, calling on people to know about and be willing to carry naloxone. And so my brother, quite frankly, still is struggling with substance use disorder, but with his permission, I share his story. And hopefully, we have saved some lives out there because of his story. And hope, and maybe it will save his life one day.
As a practicing physician in executive leadership, I can guarantee you that the availability of naloxone, Narcan, for those who don't know, absolutely is a game changer in this environment. And if we can give you credit, I'm giving it to you because it was a game changer in our community and so many others. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And while I'm incredibly proud of my work in this space, it was truly a group effort with so many families who lost. Justin Phillips is someone who I think about, and she helped change our Good Samaritan laws here in Indiana and increase availability of naloxone because she lost her son to an opioid overdose. You hear these stories and you come together and you work. But just as it's easy to forget how things were in 2020 with COVID, it's easy to forget that in 2017, when I was working on this advisory, there were still firefighters and police officers
Right.
who would not carry naloxone in their emergency vehicles
Right.
because of stigma. And so the truth is that when you trace back what we're now seeing in terms of declines in opioid overdose deaths, if you trace it back, it traces back to that time frame when we were able to normalize the availability of naloxone. And I'm incredibly proud of our collective efforts as a country. And it shows that we can come together around the difficult issue and actually do something that changes the way the entire population thinks about an issue and that empowers people to take action. So I hope that that can be an example for us in these tumultuous times where, it's far too easy to identify things that we disagree on and that we want to fight over, and increasingly hard to find areas of agreement.
Well, that's a master class in leadership in managing competing priorities, and other people are bringing you other priorities, and just picking that true north and working through, can we do this? Should we do this? Will we do this? How are we going to do this? And you make an impact.
And am I the right person to do this?
Sure.
Do I have, and every CMO, again, has to ask themselves that question. What's the problem? What's the set of problems that are in front of me in this role? And there's countless. Every day there's a list longer than you can go through. And is there a specific intervention that I can push forward that will help us address that problem? And in terms of buy-in, is there a unique message that I can deliver that will help us get the buy-in that we need to put this intervention into play so that we can actually get measurable progress on this problem?
Yeah. Well, let's amp this one up. So we double down. Now we're going to amp up. In the early days of COVID, as you and others were collecting data and discerning your recommendations for masking or not, whether the virus was primarily spread by droplet or an airborne pathogen, you mentioned the 40-70 rule. And it needs to be described on this show for our aspiring physician leaders. Tell us about the 40-70s.
Well, there's another story there too. I was blessed. There are a lot of challenges I faced as Surgeon General, but there are also a lot of cool things. And writing this book helped me remember some of those cool things. CMOs, I mean, it is a blessing. It is a privilege we have to be physician leaders, to be in some of these roles, even though it's easy to go in every day and tell yourself, woe is me, everything's bad. It's a privilege to be in these roles. We have access to information and opportunities that other people don't. And one of the opportunities that I had as Surgeon General was to be mentored by Colin Powell, General Colin Powell. And this 40-70 rule is not my rule. It's actually Colin Powell's rule from his book that he shared with me. And the 40-70 rule goes like this. If you make it, when you're in a leadership role, you're going to be asked to make decisions that are highly consequential and where you don't have all the information that you would like to have to make that decision with 100% certainty. So the 40-60 rule says if you make a critical decision before you have at least 40% of the information, you are likely to be wrong. But if you wait until you have more than 70% of the information, you're likely to be late. You're likely to be irrelevant. And so that's the challenge of leadership. And one of the I think underlying tenets of the 40-70 rule that's important for leaders to understand is you're going to be wrong sometimes, and when it is, you got to own it. And so I'll give you a concrete example on both ends. When it came to masking, we didn't have all the information we needed to make the recommendations that we needed to make. Why? Because quite frankly, China was not forthcoming with information about asymptomatic spread. And that would have drastically changed our recommendations early on masking. And without that information, we just simply believed that the transmission would be similar to past of respiratory viruses. I often tell people if someone has the flu and they're in a room with you, chances are they have the flu, and chances are they're going to be so sick that they're going to self-sort and not even be in that room.
That's right.
But that said, with COVID, over half the people who have COVID have no clue that they have it. And that is why ultimately we came to a place where we recommended masking when COVID was widespread, because you can't just look at someone and tell that they have the flu and they don't, or tell that they have COVID and they don't know that they have COVID. So they're out at restaurants and at sporting events with you. Now, that said, an example of the other end is the CDC. The CDC was so scared of being wrong that they waited and waited and waited to issue guidance. And then when they would issue the guidance, usually the public had already decided what they were going to do before the CDC guidance came out. An example of this is back to school measures. The CDC waited so long to give people guidance on going back to school that most school districts across the country, particularly across the South, had already decided what they were going to do. And then the CDC guidance became irrelevant.
Yep. There's principles here that I will share with you and ask if you agree or disagree. So in leadership, the higher you go, the more ambiguous things are, and you have to be capable of living in the ambiguity. You don't necessarily get comfortable with it, but you do have to develop the capability to manage through it. And the 40-70 rule really does help, right?
Well, it helps you feel better about the decision that you're making. It helps you make more informed decisions and better decisions, number one. Number two, it gives you comfort in the event that you're wrong, to be able to say, okay, I'm wrong, but I made the best decision that I could with the information that I had and the time frame that I had.
And that's what the leader has to do. They have no choice. The buck stops with that person making that decision. And to your point earlier, there's too much criticism in our current culture about leadership decisions. And until you've walked in the leader's shoes, it's just a little bit hard to appreciate. But
that's a lot of what I actually do in the book, as you recall, is try to paint the picture for folks that here's the decision we had to make.
Right.
And here are the variables around it, the time sensitivity or the political pressures that presented themselves, and here's why this happened. It's easy in hindsight to say, well, you were wrong. Okay, yeah, we were wrong. But to understand you were wrong, but you were wrong based on not having enough information, or you were wrong based on the fact that you had to make a decision. Again, about masking, and I talk about this in the book. I'm very open about mistakes that I made. I put out a tweet telling people not to hoard masks. And in the moment, it was when people literally were hoarding masks, buying up masks, and healthcare workers couldn't access them. Mm-hmm. And so I had a consequential moment and decision to make, because my colleagues who were trying to take care of folks who had this novel, deadly respiratory disease did not have the equipment that they needed to protect themselves. And so I put out a tweet telling people not to hoard masks. And I went on to say they've not been shown to be effective in preventing spread of viruses like the flu, which was a true statement. But again, I was on the wrong side of the 40-70 rule and didn't realize it because of China not sharing information. But again, I think it's important for us to understand that you're going to have to make, as you mentioned, tough decisions, and you need to have a rubric, a framework to help guide you and to help give you reassurance on the back end in the event that you make a poor decision. It's easy if you made the right decision.
And I think, yes, it is easy if you make the right decision. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good too. But
Exactly.
as a physician, we are trained and hammered, and I don't care which residency or specialty you do, you get hammered into being as accurate as humanly possible, utilizing all the information. And you and I have been in medicine long enough to know that suddenly new information shows up and we start to alter our decisions. And I think that as physician leaders, not only is the 40-70 rule so applicable, we actually use it, but we don't realize we use it.
Exactly.
Because we make decisions based on our biological information of yesterday. And to your point about COVID being a rampant asymptomatic spreading event, that in our history, we didn't have that biological awareness about that. So we acted with the same information we traditionally act with until we understood what kind of pathogen, and therefore we change our decision making. Physicians are good at that, but they don't like to think like that. They think they're 100% right all of the time. And you have, I guarantee you, when you were practicing full time, you were making decisions with the best available knowledge that you had to save that patient's life or give them the right, appropriate management of their ventilatory capacity or whatever you had to do in the moment. Agreed?
Well, I literally had a scenario yesterday. I still practice one day a week. I was in the operating room yesterday, and the punchline is I had a patient who had bronchospasm and presented in the OR with rapid desaturations. And this was a patient who didn't have asthma, who had no COPD, and all I knew was the saturations were going down quickly, and I had to figure out what was what, and I had to, in a very short amount of time. And that's what's interesting as an anesthesiologist, particularly at a trauma center. Some people have the luxury of sitting back and, and thinking on things and, and debating it with their colleagues and doing a tumor board and figuring out, okay, what do you guys think about this? I had about 30 seconds to figure out what was going on and pull out epi and give epi to this patient in bronchospasm, to save their life. And so it's something that as a physician, I very much understand, but it's hard to communicate that to the public because I could have been wrong, but I made the best guess that I could based on my knowledge, my experience from the past about what this likely was. It could have been, it could have been any number of other causes,
right.
but you didn't have an option in that moment. You had to make a decision.
Yeah. Well, you would have enjoyed my tumor board because after people jawed for too long, I just said, what are we going to do, guys? Next case. So I'm just saying. All right. So,
well, yeah, at some point the conversation has to move on.
Yeah. All right. So we're gonna go a little bit deeper again. In the book, you stated that you worked particularly hard to be the nation's doctor and not President Trump's Surgeon General. And you were attacked for either saying something or not saying something relative to politics and the mainstream media. Can you elaborate on what was going through your mind when you generated that sort of true north? I'm the nation's doctor.
Well, number one, I have a number of mentors who've reinforced this to me over my career as a physician executive. That once you take on this role, you have to understand what your true north is, and your true north is to do right by the patient. And so I'll give you an example of this that's completely outside of my experience in politics. But when you're working for a for-profit hospital, you may come into conflict with what the hospital wants to do to make money versus what you feel is the right thing to do for patients or for physicians. And when that occurs, you have to understand what your true north is and be able to articulate, here is what I recommend or what I'm doing, and here is why. And I recognize that conflicts with your priorities, boss, but this is what you hired me to do. And so, to put it in the context of being the Surgeon General, when I went into this role, it was impressed upon me. And Colin Powell is another one where Colin Powell was one of the people who told me this. He said, you are the United States Surgeon General. He said, you're not the Surgeon General for Black people. And this is an interesting point. here because, again, it's one of those unique challenges I faced being the first African American Surgeon General, similar to Barack Obama being the first African American president. You get pressure from certain communities to do more for those communities because they see themselves in you. And then you get criticized whenever you do something for those communities because people perceive that you're giving them preferential treatment.
Yeah,
But
you wrote about that in the book so well. Keep going.
and Colin Powell, said to me, your job is to be the United States Surgeon General. I had another mentor, Woody Myers, who was the first Black Health Commissioner of Indiana. I was the second. I mean, he's still a mentor of mine. And he said, your job is to be the Indiana Health Commissioner, not the governor's health commissioner. And your job is to be the United States Surgeon General, not Trump's Surgeon General. And what's interesting is I was able to do that successfully until 2020. 2020, you had COVID, but what a lot of people know but don't appreciate is that we had a once in a century pandemic that was superimposed on top of a once in a generation presidential election, an incredibly contentious presidential election. And so everything I started saying about the pandemic was framed through the lens of, is this what Trump agrees with or is this what Biden agrees with? Because then people use that to try to gain electoral advantage for their preferred party or their preferred candidate. And that is when the media first started portraying me not as the United States Surgeon General, but as Trump's Surgeon General. And they still, to this day, there was an article that came out this week in The Hill, a media outlet, about me, where they interviewed me about the recent ACIP um, uh, 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 happenings, which I'm very concerned about. The 17 members of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices were purged by the current administration, and and I gave my comments. I did not mention Donald Trump once in those comments. The headline says Donald Trump's former Surgeon General is his biggest critic. And so, again, that political framing. And so I tell you that to say that I was fighting the media. I was fighting people who are politically oriented, and I was fighting on behalf of the science to establish myself as the United States Surgeon General, as America's doctor, and not as someone who was acting on behalf of Donald Trump or who was seen as doing something simply to please Donald Trump, or simply someone who was appointed by Donald Trump. Because, again, the media does that for page clicks, but it orients people's thinking in a way that really, I think, prevents them from being able to see the bigger picture. A story that I tell, and I think this is your listeners would be interested in this story because we're coming up on 4th of July. So it was almost exactly around this time in 2020. And Donald Trump said that he was going to hold a rally at Mount Rushmore, a 4th of July rally at Mount Rushmore. And people lost their minds. They said, how dare he hold a rally in the middle of a pandemic? It's going to kill people. They wanted me to condemn this rally, this gathering. And so I was brought on the news and asked, won't you condemn this rally that Donald Trump wants to hold? Because the headline that they wanted was Donald Trump Surgeon General says Donald Trump shouldn't be holding this rally. And what I said was, look, I want people to understand their personal risk. Are you someone who's older? Are you someone who's got comorbidities? Are you someone who lives with someone who's vulnerable? I want them to understand the circumstances around what they're thinking about doing. Are you going to be inside? Are you going to be outside? Are people going to be masking? And then I want them to make the best possible choice for them. That's what I said. I got ripped to shreds by Don Cheadle, an Avenger. I got ripped to shreds by Axl Rose. He called me a piece of shit. Are we allowed to say that on your podcast? I'm quoting here. Called me Rose, Guns N' Roses, called me a piece of shit. Many people in the medical community attacked me for not condemning Donald Trump's rally. But here's the thing. At the same time, Donald Trump was holding his rally. There were Black Lives Matter protests going on all across the country. And if I went on CNN or MSNBC and condemned Donald Trump's rally and Mount Rushmore, I was going to have to go on Fox News and tell Sean Hannity why I wasn't also condemning the Black Lives Matter rallies, because the science tells us that the virus doesn't care which rally you're at.
Yeah.
And so as a doctor, I gave the best and most non-judgmental, non-political advice that I could for people to protect themselves. but people could only hear it through the lens of you're supporting Donald Trump or you're going against Donald Trump. And that impacted their ability to actually process the science behind what I was saying.
Yeah, listen, your battle scars are a little bit bigger than mine, but myself and my other CMO partners, I know that we all went through this battle of what is in the best interest of the patient. And when we talk about organizations or the United States, it is nothing more than a conglomerate of patients. And we're
Mm-hmm.
there to serve them either in my community or in the capital. And it is our responsibility. And I tell the students in the class, you don't have to do this, but be willing to do this and put it somewhere in your mental file cabinet. Be ready to be fired for
Yep.
sticking up for what is clinically appropriate, medically appropriate, ethically appropriate, and move on. Because until you are working all with physicians who are all like-minded, or other, the nurses and your respiratory therapists, until you're in that, like a tumor board, we can all fight and at the end of the day agree this is what we're going to do for the patient.
Uh-huh.
The boss may say you need more chemotherapy administered or more radiation, we need more revenue. Yeah, okay, but I got to take care of the patient. So
Yep.
we think a little bit alike, and I appreciate you giving us that story.
Well,
So
well, I mentioned Woody Myers early on. He told me my first day as health commissioner of Indiana. He said, and it was shocking to me then, but it's very similar to what you just said. My first day, he said, go in the office and write your resignation letter. And I said, what? He said, you need to, number one, come to peace with the fact that you may end up being fired, but you also need to understand where your guardrails are and again, what your true north is. And if you do that, then when these difficult decisions come up, you will be able to reflect back on, okay, this is why I'm here. This is what my true north is. And if it means I'm going to be fired, then I'm okay with that. Absolutely. And to your point about these tough decisions, a lot of people, one of the things that I don't want people to think is that these are only decisions that happen when you're Surgeon General of the United States. To your point, CMOs and doctors and hospitals deal with this literally every winter when flu ticks up. Okay, at what point are we going to restrict visitors to the hospital? At what point are we going to tell people they need to mask again? The debate's ongoing right now about vaccine mandates. To what extent do we need to compel health providers to get vaccinated in order to protect the patients who we've taken an oath to serve? I mean, I say this, no one should go in a hospital and get sick from being in a hospital. No one should. But that said, it's going to bring up conflict between the rights of an individual provider to choose to get vaccinated or not, or mask or not, or the rights of a patient to come in and see grandma who's dying in the ICU versus the rights of everyone else in that hospital to be safe. And they aren't easy decisions. And here is why I'm doing it, because I feel there's a greater good. And here's what I'm going to do to try to mitigate that harm to folks.
yeah, yeah. Tough stuff, man. Tough stuff. All right, two last questions as we get to the end of this. So, how do we, as leaders in the healthcare community, push back against misinformation, disinformation, and what I was recently taught as malinformation, the malicious and intentional use of
Uh-huh.
information in an age of overwhelming online bullying? You lived through it. So many of your colleagues that were state medical officers or public health officials that were forced out of their job or quit and paid the price of service. That's a quote from your book. How do we combat that malinformation that's going on?
Number one, we need better communications training for public health professionals and for medical professionals. I tell folks, if you ask me a question, I've been trained to prepare you a 45-minute, 60-slide PowerPoint presentation. I've not been trained to go on CNN and deliver to Jake Tapper in a combative interview the key information in 2 to 3 minutes. And so we need communications training to be able to be successful in this world where people are consuming information in 30-second TikToks and on podcasts and on social media and in headlines. There is a science behind it, and we need exposure to that science and that training. So that's number one. Number two, we need more science in recognizing and combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And it's going to be harder and harder to do in this new age of AI, where literally they can create a fake you and me and now actually have me, Jerome Adams, the former Surgeon General, telling you something that is not true. So we need research into that space. And as physicians, just as we keep up with medical information as part of our responsibility, we need to keep up with how information is being communicated to people. But the most important thing is something I said earlier. It's to remember that people need to know that you care before they care what you know. And I'll give you a different spin on this. Too often we shame and blame people for a decision not to get vaccinated or a decision not to do something that's consistent with common medical advice or with our medical advice. But behind every person who is not vaccinated is a story. And I often say that story, if you dig deep enough, if you take the time to ask and to listen, almost always can be traced back to a bad experience they had with the medical system that caused them to lose faith, to lose trust in what the medical system is telling them to do. And if you don't understand that and get to that first and acknowledge that and validate that, you're never going to be able to then build the trust moving forward for them to trust what you're recommending to them. People need to know that you care before they care what you know. And something that we can lean on is the Gallup surveys that consistently tell us that even as trust in health, the healthcare system, air quotes here, or trust in government, again, air quotes here, is at an all-time low. The three groups that are the most trusted on health are doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. And it's not doctors writ large, mind you. It's your doctor. It's your nurse. It's your pharmacist. And so to the listeners out there, I would say if you are a medical professional, you have unique credibility with your patients. And if you're a patient, you trust your doctor, your nurse, your pharmacist. Don't listen to Joe Rogan. Don't listen to me or Tony Fauci. Listen to your doctor, your nurse, your pharmacist, and know that you have a unique capability, but also a unique responsibility if you're a health provider to be informed and to use your voice and your credibility to help everyone understand the science. And I say that truly as a call to action for all the health professionals out there to remember that you have unique credibility with the people in your life because of the credentials that you've worked hard to obtain. With great power comes great responsibility. Now we're quoting Spider-Man here. But recognize that and leverage that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said, and it's very powerful. And there is an obligation to meet our patients where they're at, and to create that trusted environment at every level. And I think, unfortunately, our public health system, and maybe you'll sharply disagree, it's underfunded, it's understaffed, it's low on the priority ladder list at both the federal and the state level, but a requirement for our national security. And you hinted that at the book as well. Our national self-interests require a robust public health system. And many of our state surgeon generals and public health officials did not yet have the trust of their constituents because they weren't in a position by money, resources, time, energy. And so they're coming at it in that below the 40 rule. They didn't have enough, and they're trying to establish trust quickly with those of us in the trenches. And it was a really difficult time, and nobody should underestimate that. But I don't know, do you have any thoughts? This is my last question about what is our public response or governmental or political response to building up our public health system in this country?
Yeah. So that's a great question to close on, and it's something that I've been wondering how and where to work in. But you talk about communication, you talk about misinformation. I want to remind folks of Maslow's hierarchy. And Maslow's hierarchy tells us what people prioritize and why they prioritize certain things in their life. And the number one priority in Maslow's hierarchy is basic needs: food, water, shelter. Next on the hierarchy is safety and security. You have to find food, water, and shelter to live. And once you do all those things, then comes things like caring about your community and about being altruism and self-actualization, being the best you that you can be. And so I say that to tell people, most folks out there, you're going to have a hard time convincing them to prioritize health for health's sake. What we need to do is a better job of helping people understand how we tie health into the things that they care about. And so in the United States, most people acquire food, water, and shelter through money. And they get that money through having a job. So one of the things I did frequently as Surgeon General, and I will often do, is tie community health and the poor health of individuals in our community back to workforce and back to business. I actually put out a report when I was Surgeon General called Community Health and Economic Prosperity, making the case that the U.S. spends far more than any OECD nation, than any nation, on healthcare, that has some of the worst health outcomes, and that's hurting our economy. We're spending a large proportion of our money on health insurance and on health payments. And in Indiana, that's been successful. We were one of the first red states, if you will, to utilize the Affordable Care Act expansion funding to increase healthcare insurance. There's still over a dozen red states that haven't done that. We did that in Indiana under Mike Pence, and we didn't do it because people inherently felt that they had a role in making other people healthy. We did it because we partnered with the Chamber of Commerce, with businesses, to make the workforce argument that a healthy workforce leads to a healthy bottom line. I also, when I was Surgeon General, worked with the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force to make the case for health as a national security imperative. 70% of them are 18 to 24-year-olds right now are ineligible for military service because they can't pass the physical, can't meet the educational requirements, to have a criminal background record. So remember Maslow's hierarchy, safety and security is number 2. If we can make the case that a healthier community is a safer community, then people are going to be more likely to buy in. Self-actualization is actually the lowest priority on Maslow's hierarchy. I want to be the best me that I can be, because you've got to meet all those other needs first. So you can't tell someone, well, you just need to be healthier because it's the right thing to do, and caring about other people. That's quite frankly low on Maslow's hierarchy. I hate to say it, but it is. So you can't go straight to, well, you need to do this for other people, or you need to do this, for some moral imperative, while not recognizing that if they feel like that's at the expense of their safety and security or their ability to meet their basic needs, they're not going to pay attention. So that's what I would say we need to do to make the broader case for public health infrastructure, is to tie it back to workforce, economy, and safety and security. And if we do that, then we have more success.
Yeah, I think you make a great argument for workforce expansion going upstream, and that alone will help bend the cost curve back in the right direction.
Exactly.
And you said it so well. Well, I'm going to wrap this up with you. My close circle knows that I'm intentionally private about my faith, but I am a man of faith, and I have come to believe before this show, and it's only been reinforced with this show, that you were placed as a U.S. Surgeon General in 2017 by a higher power, because you know what it's like to be unable to breathe when you felt unsafe and insecure and looking at something that an 8-year-old cannot even fathom. And you know what it's like for our underrepresented communities. You know what it's like when it comes to health and education. And as an anesthesiologist, you probably know everything there is to know about ventilators and oxygen delivery. And COVID hit while you were as the Surgeon General. So on behalf of the community of physicians and physician leaders everywhere, let me publicly thank you for your service while in office and through your time dealing with COVID-19. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for saying that, and thank you for the conversation. And to all the listeners out there, thank you for all that you do each and every day, because we all do our little parts to make our nation healthier, safer, and to help everyone be the best person that they can be.
Well, that is a wrap, my friend. You have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. If you want access to the hottest items on physician leadership, especially if you want to become a Chief Medical Officer, visit our new website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and sign up with us. Tell us what the next hot mess in healthcare is about and what physician leaders should be doing about it. Clearly, I love talking with physician leaders and chief medical officers from all over the United States and bringing their stories to you. So please connect, leave your comments, share this with your colleagues, and in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.